Welcome to Two Guys in a Classroom. I'm Garrett Henson, here with my friend Joseph Dickinson, and today we're going to be discussing the Gradual Release teaching method. Imagine you're some dirty street kid in the year 1300. We're talking way back in the Game of Thrones era, when you were either a noble person or a peasant. And like most people, you happen to be a peasant. So your family wants you to succeed in the world as much as any peasant can, but you're never going to slay dragons or conquer kingdoms, so you need to learn a skill. You could be a brewer, or a candle maker, or a carpenter, but for the purposes of our discussion, let's say your folks decide you're going to be a blacksmith. Now, there's no vocational college or high school shop class to teach you the skills you need. So what do? Well, around the age of 14, you become an apprentice to a master blacksmith who will teach you the skills you need to become a blacksmith yourself somewhere down the road. You spend the next several years working with this blacksmith, and at first, you just do a lot of watching. The master blacksmith doesn't want you messing up his products because at this point, you don't know anything. So you just observe the way he works, and he explains the process to you step by step in detail. You watch as he heats the forge and hammers the material and grinds away the imperfections, learning by his example. And then slowly but surely, you're ready to start taking on real responsibilities. The master blacksmith lets you heat the forge, or swing the hammer, or grind the blade, but always with his supervision. He points out what you do well and not so well. And throughout this process, you develop good habits and instincts for the work you're doing. Now fast forward to the end of the apprenticeship, where you're allowed to do all the same tasks that the master blacksmith does. He looks over your work at the end to make sure you've done a good job, and maybe he gives you some feedback, but the point is, you now have all the skills to be a blacksmith, and eventually you'll be free to go out and start your own shop and take on your own apprentices, because you'll finally be a master at the trade. This is a really common way to teach valuable skills throughout the medieval and Enlightenment eras, and it's based on a teaching method that many teachers still use today in modern classrooms. Today, this method is called Gradual Release, and it's based on the notion that students should learn concepts and skills in a very specific order. First by example, second by collaboration, and third on their own. The teacher or master begins by modeling how to complete a certain kind of task or assignment, and then moves on to work with the students cooperatively together. Only after these two crucial steps are taken does the teacher allow the student to attempt the work on their own. This gives students the chance to really understand the process of what they're expected to do, and it can be an extremely effective method for that reason. So with that introduction in mind, Joseph is going to break down for us what gradual release is. What's its history, and why is it so effective?
So gradual release is based on a lot of educational philosophy that started to pick up in the 80s and 90s, but it owes a lot to the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who famously divided the stages of learning into 3 tiers, the lowest tier being when the learner cannot do a skill at all, the middle tier being when the learner can do a skill with assistance, and the highest being when the learner can do a skill on their own. Vygotsky called this model the zone of proximal development, but today we tend to refer to it as scaffolding. If you're a teacher, you've probably heard this term before, but it basically refers to all the different kinds of instructional support that you give a student on their way to mastery. If you think of scaffolding in its literal form, the word means a supporting framework, like the frame of a house before you put up the brick and sheetrock. The idea is you build a frame of understanding for your student by teaching them in steps. And this is where gradual release comes in. Gradual release is just a specific form of scaffolding that's based on Vygotsky's stages of learning, and it boils down to the phrase, I do, we do, and you do. It begins with the teacher in full control of the learning process, providing an example for the students. This isn't a time to take the questions or to have students doing any work at all. You just want them watching you and your expert approach. This is the I do step, with the I being the teacher. The second step is a little more flexible, but it always involves some element of collaboration. It could be that you allow the students to try to walk you back through the process you just modeled for them. It could be that you put them in pairs and allow them to work through the process together while you walk around and offer support. The important aspect of this step is to have students working together, not only because they haven't yet mastered the skill, but also because they aren't comfortable being responsible for the material on their own. This is the part of gradual release where you're the dad holding onto the handlebars while your kid is learning to ride a bike. You don't want to let go of those handlebars too soon, and that's the whole point of the we do step. The last step is the most straightforward. You let go of those handlebars and hopefully your students pedal away on their own. You want to make sure they can now apply their knowledge without assistance, and this is what we mean by mastery. This step might involve an actual quiz or test to measure your students' progress, but it could also be something as simple as an exit pass, where students turn in their individual work at the end of class for you to review. The point is, we've arrived at the you do step of the gradual release model, where students take ownership of the content. This step also lets you know if you need to return to either of the previous steps. If your kids just aren't getting it, they may need more modeling or collaboration to make the knowledge click.
So a lot of STEM teachers are already using a version of gradual release in their classrooms, whether they know it or not. In an algebra course, a teacher might start her lessons by working equations on the whiteboard for the students to see. Afterwards, she might have students work an example problem with a partner and then go over the results together as a class. The homework or the quiz that follows after is the final step. It's an evaluation to see if students have mastered the material or not. So it's a pretty straightforward approach for those sorts of subjects. But I wanted to give an example of how gradual release works in non-STEM classes like mine and Joseph's. So in my case, we're dealing with language arts, and specifically composition. The trick with composition is always to make the writing process clearer to students, because it's really easy to look at a piece of writing and see that it's good or bad, but the actual process can be really difficult to break down into steps for students. My way of giving that breakdown is to use gradual release. When my students start on a new essay, I always start with paper models. I write up my own sample essay, which I make sure is really strong and meets the specific requirements of the assignment. I go through the paper models with my classes, pointing out the strengths of the sample essays and breaking down the overall writing into manageable pieces, a focused introduction, an organized body paragraph, a relevant conclusion that resolves the paper. My students are expected to listen and watch during this phase. I may answer a question here and there, but for the most part, I want them focused on noticing what specific qualities make a good paper work. This is my version of the I do step, where students get to see what mastery looks like through a really strong example paper. The we do step can take several different shapes. Sometimes I give my students a topic and some basic information, and then I open a Word document on the overhead projector where we start writing a paper together as a class, line by line. Students raise their hands or call out suggestions. They talk amongst themselves about how to improve and revise these suggestions, and I give my own feedback and thoughts throughout the process because I'm still the one who's actually doing the typing at the computer. I'm in charge of the document, which is my way of keeping my hand on those handlebars at this step in the process. When the class goes quiet and they aren't sure what to do, I ask a directed question or make an open-ended suggestion that gives them a spark to move forward. And by the end of the class, we have a short paper that we wrote together, collaboratively. And usually that looks like an A paper, more or less. This takes away the mystery of writing papers for students. They see exactly how the process looks and get to participate in that process with me and their peers. Another step I take is to draw out this we do phase of the gradual release process to make students turn in pre-writing and drafts, which I give feedback on. This is a really common approach that allows you to collaborate with students up until the final draft of the paper, which is the obvious last step where students demonstrate their mastery or not.
The best example I can use is when I teach document-based questions, or DBQs as I call them. DBQs is where I give the students different articles, political cartoons, or charts, and then provide a question that goes with the whatever primary or secondary source I may have provided. Then the student will give a short answer that first consists of restating the question with their answer, provide evidence from the source, and last, provide more evidence, previous knowledge, or a life example. Students sometimes can get confused on a political cartoon or what exactly an article is saying, so I do the first question with them. For example, I model the entire first question. First, I'll read the question aloud, then I'll go back to the source and find my evidence, whether it is from a reading or drawing. Then I restate the question, providing my answer, and provide evidence. While restating the question and providing evidence, I am writing it on the board, and the students are expected to write as I write. Lastly, I'll provide more evidence or previous knowledge, and the students will once again write it down. During the we do step, I will let students work on the next question where they will work with a partner or neighbor on the same type of question, just different wording. The last step of gradual release will be the I do when I check for understanding during a formative or summative assessment.
So to wrap things up, why is gradual release a useful teaching method? Well, first of all, it offers a really straightforward, effective way to structure lessons. The I do, we do, you do steps can be incorporated into almost any lesson plan for any subject and can be a great way to add variety to your classes to keep students engaged. But on a deeper level, it can also make students more comfortable with the material before they're expected to do the work on their own. Just like a child doesn't want their parent to let go of the handlebars too soon, most students need a certain level of familiarity and confidence before they can achieve mastery. Gradual release allows them to take on responsibility for the material in stages instead of all at once. By the final step, students hopefully walk away with a sense of ownership for what they just learned. And that sense of ownership is what leads to greater curiosity and competency in all things. In other words, gradual release is effective because it's considerate of the student's needs, both long-term and short-term. And that's why it's such a great tool for us as educators.
So you probably noticed that we've been on a hiatus for several months here after our first episode, and that was because we both started new teaching jobs, not to mention the fact that my wife and I just had our first kid.
But hopefully life cooperates in the future, because our plan is to release a new episode every month focused around concepts like gradual release. We've got interviews lined up and lots of ideas for things we want to discuss with you guys. So thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you sticking with us.
This has been another episode of Two Guys in a Classroom. I'm Joseph Dickinson.
And I'm Garrett Henson.
We'll see you next time.